the show East West. Jack Chow is my name with G&E TV with lots of proud. Today we're talking about this very controversial issue. Controversial being that lots of people on the left, on the right, from all directions giving comment about the recent deal, the international negotiation with Iranian nuclear programs, call it the nuke programs or whatever. So deals are supposed to be made, and right now it's going through the Senate, and President Obama has already vowed to veto whatever that takes the deal away. So it's a very confusing situation. To get to the point, once again, we have invited our dear guest, Honorable James Lee, here to share his view with us. And Mr. James Lee has rich experiences in both the federal and the state level with politics, and he was once the advisor for President Bush, both 41 and 43. Later, he became the spokesman for former governor of California, Pete Wilson. So, Honorable James Lee.
Oh, it's good to be here, Jack.
All right, good. All right, good. Now, simply, the question is very simple. It's very confusing, but the question is very simple. Is it a good deal or a bad deal?
Well, it really depends on who you ask that question to. If you ask the Iranians, they feel this is a great deal for them because they basically get to keep their nuclear infrastructure, their centrifuges, hardened facilities, and so forth. They also get to sell oil back on the open market. They also get access to about $160 billion in frozen cash. Plus, they basically get no change or modification in their foreign policy in terms of supporting the different terrorist groups they support or the proxy wars that are going on or stuff like that. If you ask a lot of conservative Democrats or Republicans in Congress what we got, optimistically, the best you got is the hope that Iran will not cheat. And that's basically it. It's a deal that, frankly, no other president other than President Obama would have done. And that's in large part because President Obama is desperately seeking a foreign policy win on his way out of office. Because if you look at his previous 7 years in office, he hasn't had a foreign policy win. So this is really the last gasp effort on President Obama's part to get a deal done. The problem really is going to be the enforcement, and that's going to be for the next president to have to oversee.
I see.
Because this deal does not have standards that we normally have associated with nuclear treaties like
What is there in the deal, though, exactly?
Well, specifically speaking, the deal covers three key areas. One, it covers the idea of nuclear infrastructure. The Iranians have to make reductions in the amount of enriched uranium they have. They have to make reductions in the amount of centrifuges they operate that can make that enriched uranium. And they have to make changes in terms of converting some of their existing facilities. The second area they have to make changes is in their inspections program. They have to allow inspectors into all known facilities, but any military facility, the international inspectors have to get permission. And if they don't know about a facility, like a secret facility, for example, we're not allowed access unless we find out about it, in which case Iran gets 24 days before inspectors are allowed in.
I see.
And then the third part is sanctions. And basically this deal would lift sanctions placed by the United Nations. It would lift sanctions placed by the European Union. And it would lift sanctions that the U.S. has placed, both executive order by presidents, including President Obama, President Bush, and President Clinton, as well as congressional sanctions that have been placed since 1995. So those sanctions cover everything from access to frozen assets, being able to engage in international commerce and trade again, as well as the most sensitive issue, being able to buy and sell weapons. And those weapons include everything from ballistic missiles down to machine guns.
All right. Let's talk about the three areas specifically, one by one. Say, first we talk about a reduction, right? So is it just a word reduction, or you have certain targets or certain steps by percentage or by how do you quantify the reduction?
Under the agreement, Iran has to reduce by 90% its stockpile of low enriched uranium, and it has to get its uranium enrichment level to under 3.7%. The reason why you want to get under 3.7% is 5% enrichment is the basis for all fuel stocks that you need to enrich to weapons grade.
I see.
And so if you eliminate and get down to below 3.7%, that reduces the amount of fissionable material.
So there are requirements to describe the reduction.
Yeah, if you're a proponent of this deal, there are specific requirements in terms of reducing the stockpile. The problem is this, though. Under the interim agreement, which was the agreement that was negotiated in April, until this agreement, Iran was required to go ahead and reduce that supply under the interim agreement. The problem is that during the interim agreement, the stockpile of low fissionable material actually increased by 20%.
I see.
So even under the previous interim agreement, it didn't go down, it went up.
I see.
And that's a little bit of a problem for a lot of people looking at this deal.
Okay, speaking to inspection though, speaking about inspection though, 24 days, do you think 24 days will be enough for the Iranians to hide something?
Oh, sure.
Hide those things that they don't want us to see?
Because, you have to remember that, what you're hiding from inspectors isn't necessarily large infrastructure. You're not going to hide centrifuges. What you're hiding, for example, is fuel. And what you're hiding, for example, is data. And so, the thing that you have to remember is that the weaponization of nuclear weapons, the creation of it, doesn't happen on a lab table. It happens in a supercomputer.
I see.
Because you have to model the type of warhead, you have to test an explosive to set it off, and a triggering device. All of that stuff exists in hardened facilities that the Iranians have. So if you have 24 days to get rid of evidence, what you're really getting rid of are the hard drives.
I see.
And of computers. And as we know, whether or not it's the IRS or Hillary Clinton, getting rid of hard drives is actually pretty easy.
All right. They can copy of it, obviously. They can't hide it somewhere else.
Inspectors can't look at a hard drive if the hard drive doesn't exist.
They're just saying about the misunderstanding understanding about the kind of hiding stuff. Talking about that possibly, people are under the impression of that as if they are moving a coal mine or somewhere.
No. I mean,
or hide a whole mountain or move some whole area out of the vision, right?
You have to understand
it's not that nature.
A large part of any nuclear design program happens not in a mine or in a big facility. It happens in an office.
Those centrifuge towers can remain there.
Yeah, and under the agreement, the Iranians are allowed to keep about 6,000 of those centrifuges out of the 20,000 they currently operate. But the agreement doesn't require the extra centrifuges to be destroyed. It just requires them to be put in storage.
I see.
And so the real problem a lot of people have is that all we've done is push the problem down the road, because we've moved the timeline from about 1 year and 3 years to 8 and 10 years. The problem is that after the Iranians reach a 10-year period where the agreement expires, they're free. They are free to go ahead and build whatever nuclear weapon they want. That's the important part.
You're saying till the end of this agreement.
Yeah.
When that expires, they are free.
Yeah, there is no monitoring or restriction after that.
I see.
So all we've done is make the Iranians patient.
The deal, if it is cut already, if it is already cut, it has a lifespan of no more than 10 years.
Yeah, there are some parts that last for 15 years, but after that, the Iranians are free from all international monitoring.
How about sanctions? We're talking about sanctions as a third part.
Yeah,
though.
the sanctions are the most troubling because there are no restrictions on how the Iranians can use their money. So, for example, if you think back to why sanctions were put in place in the first place, when President Clinton put sanctions into place, those were done because the Iranians were engaging in terrorist activities. They were not nuclear. Those first initial ones, because the Iranians were supporting Hezbollah in Lebanon. Financially and with weapons.
Yes.
And then President Bush put additional sanctions into place because the Iranians conducted a nuclear program in secret. I mean, the Iranians were hiding it. The only reason why we knew, even the CIA didn't know the Iranians were building facilities. The only reason we knew about it was because Iranian dissident groups and resistance groups got the information out for us. So what happens is that you've got a Democratic and Republican president that have put sanctions on this regime for really secret nefarious activities. Even President Obama in 2010 signed a sanctions bill, which at the time was the toughest sanctions bill ever placed on Iran. And now we're seeing all of that get rolled back. And the big problem is what you're doing is that you're rolling back not just sanctions related to the nuclear program, but you're rolling back sanctions related to terrorism activities, which aren't related to the
Now
nuclear
they're
program.
holding the sanction, whether to lift or not, depending on the findings of the inspections. Am I right?
The findings and inspections only relate to the speed of the lifting. The sanctions are going to be lifted regardless. In fact, yesterday the United Nations Security Council improved the interim pact, and they're in the process now of unwinding the UN sanctions. So they've already done it. So, the big problem we have is this. Iran right now is involved in 3 wars. They're involved in Syria, they're involved in Iraq, and they're involved in Yemen.
Okay.
At the same time, the price of oil has collapsed on the open market. That's put enormous pressure on the Iranian regime because they're running out of money. And so they are doing this deal because they need access to the $160 billion in frozen assets.
They capitulate for the money.
Well, not capitulate. They engineered this negotiation in order to get access to that money. Remember, prior to all this in 2013, there was no reason for the United States to negotiate. Okay, because President Ahmadinejad was the president of Iran at the time, and for all intents and purposes, the guy was a lunatic and nut who denied the Holocaust existed. So what did Iran do? The mullahs figured out, okay, we need to convince the West that we're touchy-feely and nice now, so they rigged an election. They eliminated all candidates on the election slate and picked their guys, including Hassan Rouhani, and they got him elected. They gave him a Twitter feed and a Facebook page, and they made him look all nice and happy and moderate, and they put him up to the West. And that is how they got the ball rolling, because they tried to convince the West that they were moderate. At the same time that was happening, they decided to go all in supporting Assad in Syria after he gassed his own people.
I see.
And so this is not really, on the one hand, Iran tries to be moderate.
It looks that we got more to talk about when we come back. Let's take a very short moment out. With me today is my good friend, Honorable James Lee, a former consultant for both President Bush 41 and 43, and a former spokesman for former governor of California, Pete Wilson. He's sharing his view on this Iranian deal issue. So let's come back to continue to find out what's inside the whole deal. And we got a future to look into, so stay with us, please. Hello, dear folks, my dear fellow Americans. Welcome back to the discussion about the Iranian deal recently being cut, or probably some part of which is going to be in practice already. With me today is my good friend, Honorable Mr. James Lee, founder and the CEO of Lee Strategy, and formerly he was the consultant of both President George Bush and George H.W. Bush, 41 and 43. And the spokesman for Governor Pete Wilson, former governor of California. So once again, welcome to the show. All right, and we're flattered that you will share your views on this issue. Look at this way, though. Take an example. If I quote unquote from Wisconsin Governor Scott Walker, he says that to terminate the bad deal with Iran on day one.
Yeah.
All right. There is a lot of power being built at the moment to stop that.
Right.
So, what they are saying is that to stop the United States. However, this is an international decision. Or it's a UN decision. If they do stop, or if they did stop, they stop only the participation of the United States getting involved. So, how do you weigh the fact?
Governor Walker is correct about the fact that an incoming president can roll back this agreement. And the reason why is because this is not a treaty. President Obama has chosen specifically not to negotiate a treaty that has to be verified and approved by the consent of the Senate. And the reason why he hasn't done that is because he wants to roll back the sanctions and do the deal administratively. Now that's a two-edged sword. The advantage for President Obama is that he can get it done quickly on his own. The disadvantage for President Obama is the next president can just change his mind and roll a lot of the stuff back. That obviously would have a dramatic impact with what the other P5+1 nations would do. You have to understand that part of the driving force for this deal, Russia and China, is that Russia wants to go back on the open market and sell military arms to Iran because they're the number one supplier of weapons to Iran. And two, China wants to do it because they want another source of oil. So if the United States, when we elect a new president, that president decides to roll back this deal in terms of sanctions, he can certainly do that. It's not binding in the classic sense that a treaty is.
I'm talking about the international negotiation as a UN resolution to go ahead.
Well, again, remember the sanctions are done by each individual body. The UN had sanctions that it put in place.
I see.
The European Union had their own sanctions. The US had their own sanctions. Individual countries have sanctions.
All right, okay.
Now understand the United States, even individual states have their own sanctions. California, Texas, Illinois, individual states even have their own sanctions. So the sanctions issue against Iran has a lot of different layers to it.
Exactly. What I'm talking about is that even if the United States, as a nation, decides not to go ahead and join the negotiation to stop the whole thing,
Or decides to roll back the deal.
All right, it's a rollback, right?
Yeah.
So will that function? Will that affect the United Nations decisions?
Well, you'd have to go back to the UN Security Council for another vote. I mean, and obviously in the UN Security Council, Russia and China have automatic vetoes, so they could kill any attempt to put sanctions back in place.
I see.
Now, there is a provision in the agreement that says that if Iran is violating the agreement by continuing its nuclear work or trying to weaponize nuclear material, that quote-unquote snapback sanctions could be put in place by the UN. And that would not require a vote, it's just a certification that Iran is cheating, in which case those sanctions would be put back in place.
Prior to the negotiation, the international negotiation, there was a saying, and a strong saying, that look at the Iranian nuclear program. It is something that neither sanction can work, nor incentive can work, nor international diplomatic approach will work, nor a war will work. So, for example, last time in 2003, when there was a suspicion about the massive destruction of weapons in Iraq, we waged a war. So, do you think there is a possibility of a war approach?
Well, look, I think this is one of the lies that comes from supporters of this deal, that the only choices are war or peace. And the peace is not really peace, it just means we're going to let Iran have nukes. So the idea that if we don't go this way, we're automatically going to go to war is frankly kind of stupid. And the reason why it's stupid is that since 1994-95, when President Clinton first posed sanctions, the policy of the United States and most of the world has been to contain and isolate Iran and prevent it from getting access to the technology and money necessary to weaponize its nuclear program. Now, if you look at from 1995 to now, we're talking about 20 years, 2 decades, it's worked. Iran doesn't have nukes. They've tried to build the facilities for it. They tried to enrich, but it comes at great cost to the regime.
They never stopped.
Right, but it came at great cost to the regime. It was very slow and it was very difficult, and they still haven't been able to do it. So the point is that the choices are not between war and peace. The choices are between war, allowing Iran to have nuclear weapons, or continue the policy of containment. And within that policy of containment, the real goal at the end of the day is regime change. And that comes if you continue to put pressure on the Iranian government to the extent that it can't support itself. Remember, the policy that President Ronald Reagan pursued in defeating communism and bringing about the end of the Cold War was not about war, and it wasn't about trying to peacefully coexist with the Soviets. It was about building Star Wars, it was about isolating the Soviets, and it was about bankrupting their economy, and it worked. And that model worked against the Soviet Union, and that model was working against Iran, and it should be allowed to continue.
You're saying that probably will work if we apply the same thing that we crapped the Soviet Union.
Yeah, and it was working because if you look at the state of the Iranian economy, their foreign currency reserves were down to $25 billion. They were overextended with military combat. Their air force is totally depleted. They're flying, F-4 Phantoms from the Vietnam era. They don't have access to any sophisticated weaponry, and their navy consists primarily of small speedboats that are running around, the Persian Gulf. They don't have the money.
It is more more confusing, even more confusing now. Now that we say we understand war approach is not a applicable approach so far,
I understand.
Right?
No one
like
has
to go to
advocated
war.
attacking
And without
Iran.
getting in war, second choice would be peace. Actually, there is no peace there.
Right.
And then sanctions obviously wouldn't work. And then
Let me push back. Sanctions were working. That's the point.
All right.
I mean, everyone is trying to make this whole idea out that sanctions weren't working. They were working because Iran, over the past 20 years, does not have a nuclear weapon, which is a better track record than we had in North Korea.
And then in that case, why don't we just stay with the sanctions and getting tightened on the sanctions?
Because President
rather
Obama,
than going with the diplomatic approach.
President Obama has made a political decision that he wants to go out on a big win in terms of foreign policy. That's the only reason why we're doing this. There is no other reason. There's no pressing, timeline. There's no, deadline that we have to meet. There was no issue or clock ticking for us to deal with the Iranians. This is all political, and it's based solely on the premise that President Obama feels that he needs to do a deal. Now, I hate to put my really big partisan hat on, but that's what this all comes down to.
All right. I see a clearer picture now. Rather than talking about war or peace, whatever, we're talking about the option between sanctions, keeping on sanctions, or the deals.
Yeah, and understand, this is a very important point.
Right.
President Obama has talked about pushing back the breakout period. The breakout period is the period of time that Iran can assemble a nuclear weapon. Okay. Under President Obama's deal, that breakout period is now 1 year. Prior to the deal, it was 3 to 4 months. So all we've done with this entire deal is push back the time that Iran can build a nuclear weapon by about 8 months. That's it.
I see.
That's all we've done. Take everything else off the table. Iran can still build a bomb in a year.
In other words, we have wasted our times.
Yeah, because this doesn't stop Iran from having a bomb. I mean, that's the most remarkable piece of stupidity that no one's really focused at.
All right, okay. My dear audience, today we're sharing some highlights from my good friend, Honorable James Lee, talking about Iranian nuclear, the nuke programs. So we'll take a short moment out. When we come back, we'll continue finding out from a larger picture. Instead of saying just the U.S., Iran, and probably we want to see the whole world. And we want to put all the nations that has the nuclear power together to see what's going on. So stay with us, please. Hello, dear folks. Welcome back to the show. Jack Chow on East West with G&E TV. Today we're talking about the Iranian nuclear programs versus the international negotiation with a deal, which, part of which is applied already as we speak. Well, even though in the United States, lots of legislators vow to put a stop even on day one, there is still quite a lot going on. So, with me today, my good friend, Honorable James Lee, former consultant for both Bush 41 and 43, also former spokesman for California, former Governor Pete Wilson. He's sharing his thoughts on this issue. So let's go to the other aspect to look into the larger pictures. We know in this world, on this global earth, we have 11 nations that have the nuclear powers already, including United States, Russia, China, India, Pakistan, so on and so forth, blah, 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 including even Israel. Right? Now there are two nations trying to get theirs, right? Iran and North Korea.
Well, North Korea already has them.
Yeah, all right, they have it. Okay, now, so now, when we say if we worry about the wrong weapons or to fall in the hands of wrong people, which is mostly our concern, right? Why don't we put up the same efforts as we do with the North Korea people?
Yeah. Well, first of all, it's important to understand that North Korea was a failure. Okay. North Korea was under sanctions. It did a similar deal like the one we're proposing to Iran. It cheated, and there were no consequences, and it was able to build nuclear weapons. And now it's testing missiles that can reach the United States. So North Korea is the classic example of why the Iranian deal will not work, because that's the model, the template that's being used for Iran. The second problem is this. When you look at the countries that have nuclear weapons, with the exception of North Korea, the vast majority of them are regimes or governments that are rational. They act with self-purpose and self-interest, and they're not rogue states that we're going to be worried about that they're going to start a nuclear exchange. So when Iran gets nuclear weapons or tries to get nuclear weapons, what's disturbing for most people is the fact that it is a religious theocracy. Its constitution vests sole authority into the supreme leader, the Ayatollah, whose control over foreign policy, military, education, judicial, cultural life is paramount and supreme. And their interpretation of divine destiny for the revolutionary spirit of their particular form of Shia belief is vested in their personal relationship with God. So when you have a state that operates in such an irrational manner, and the evidence is abundant as to how bad of a country Iran is in terms of its leadership, because they support terrorists through Hezbollah, they support the overthrow of governments and their neighbors, such as the Houthi rebels in Yemen, they support sectarian religious warfare between the Sunnis and the Shias, as they do in Iraq, and they engage in a human rights crackdown of their own people where they execute people.
Why don't we, in that case, just invade Iran and just replace their leaders?
Yeah,
like we did with Saddam Hussein.
Again, here's the thing. The opportunity existed in 2009 to overthrow the government peacefully because the Iranian people had enough. If you remember, there were mass protests, mass demonstrations, the Green Movement was taking place. The youth of Iran, which now accounts for 35% of the population under the age of 25, which is also over 50% unemployed, wanted a different life and a different change. And they protested. What did the U.S. do? We did nothing.
We missed the opportunity.
We missed the opportunity. But that opportunity is coming back again. What the news media don't know about or don't report on, which is happening in Iran right now, are mass protests and demonstrations in various parts of the country over low wages, teachers protesting about lack of pay, women protesting about the brutality they're undergoing in terms of their dress and moral codes, young people protesting over the fact that they don't have access to free communication, the internet, social media, any number of things, small business people that are chafing under the amount of corruption in the economy. All that stuff is happening right now. That's why the Iranian mullahs and the leadership want this deal so badly, because they need that $160 billion to recharge their economy and keep them in power. That's why this deal is so bad, because all it's going to do in the long run is allow the Iranian dictatorship to stay in place.
In other words, even the Iranians want to kick the can down the road.
Well, the Iranians want money. I mean, that's it.
Yeah, sure.
The Iranians
Let's get the money,
they need
and
the
we'll
cash
talk about
now.
another day.
Right. And as long as the deal does not destroy their nuclear infrastructure, does not allow them to go ahead and have to tear everything down and get rid of it, as long as they can keep it, they can start it up anytime they want. And that was the key issue for them. And then the third part is that they get to go ahead and buy weapons with the $160 billion they just got.
Yeah.
So for the Iranians, this is a great deal.
It is not hard to understand if we can probably pinpoint those facilities and the bombs, send a bomb
No,
there
understand.
and destroy it.
The Iranians built hardened facilities. Okay, for example, their facilities at Fordows is under a hardened bunker 22 meters under the ground with 8 meters worth of concrete and reinforced steel. Our best bunker buster bombs can't penetrate that. You'd have to drop a small tactical nuclear weapon to get at that bunker. Okay, and that's the only one that we know about. There are others.
There are unknown ones.
You have to understand that Iran is 636,000 square miles. Okay, the number of inspectors assigned to look at all parts of Iran under this deal is 150 guys. That's it. So, if the Iranians have been able to keep secret facilities from the CIA and the British and the French and all the other intelligence agencies, then they can obviously build facilities that we didn't know about. And that's the real problem with this deal, is that there is no, understand something. Ben Rhodes, the National Security Advisor for President Obama, back in April, he went ahead and stated publicly that our deal that we're going to negotiate is going to include a provision for anytime, anywhere inspections, meaning that inspectors can go anywhere they want, whenever they wanted. Now, Secretary Kerry and Ben Rhodes have stated publicly, no, we never said that. That's not part of this deal. The inspections, we have to provide notice. The flip-flop that's been done here is worthy of an Olympic swimming competition because they've completely cowed down and caved into what the mullahs want.
I see. Okay, on the other side of the coin, though, there are lots of people, including the Iranians, say this, quote unquote. They say, okay, there is only once in human race when atom bomb were applied, and the United States were the only nation who used it. So,
well, here's the simple thing,
that?
Okay? If the Iranians get, I will tell you, if the Iranians get a nuclear weapon, they will be the second nation on this planet to use it.
On who?
Well, let's understand who the Iranians want to destroy. Christians, Jews, and Sunni Muslims, and anyone else that is not an adherent to their particular Shia fundamental belief. Understand something. What's going on in the Middle East is a religious war. It is a religious war because Iran sits at the heart of Shia extremism and radicalism. And this type of fundamental belief they have requires that women have to wear, the burqas. They can't drive cars by themselves. If they do, they're beaten on the street. Acid is thrown on their face. Misogyny laws are passed allowing Iranian men to marry their stepdaughters as young as age 13, that child brides are legal, that a person could be arrested for religious beliefs, whether or not you're a Christian, Jew, or Yazidi. Remember, there are 4 American citizens right now being held in Iranian prisons without trial, without charge, and they haven't been even included in this deal, and yet they're sitting there. One of them, a gentleman by the name of Abedini, is in prison because he was passing out Bibles for private home church worship. Hekmeti was a former U.S. Marine. Jason Rezian, who is a Washington Post reporter and is now being accused of spying because he wrote stories about Iran. That is who we're dealing with here. This is a country that punishes people for petty crimes by using power saws to cut their hands off, by hanging them. You go to Amnesty International. If anybody really wants to understand how bad Iran is, go on Google, type in Iran, and type in hanging, and go to images, and you will see for yourself every single day the type of barbarity that's practiced in Iran. Okay. Right. Does this deal do anything to change Iran's behavior? No.
In other words, am I right if I understand this way? The fact that the world, the massive destructive weapons can be checking and balancing is because there are people who are afraid of death.
Rational people.
Okay. Who are afraid of death.
Right.
Okay. When you are dealing with people who are not afraid of death, though, so that's a totally different story.
Yeah.
Am I right?
Understand something. You're dealing with a regime that praises and celebrates martyrdom.
Yeah.
Okay.
They martyr themselves over anything
So
they believe.
the idea that a regime that finds it perfectly acceptable to support a government like Assad that uses nerve gas to kill its own people and not find that objectionable is going to have a problem using a nuke.
Okay. All right, good answer. My dear audiences, let's take a short moment now. When we come back, we'll find out. When we put all the pieces together, we'll see, is it a good deal or a bad deal? So stay with us. Hello, dear folks. Welcome back to the discussion. As a matter of fact, we're talking about a big issue of on this global Earth today over the Iranian nuclear program issue versus the international negotiation with a deal. Joining me, my good friend, Honorable James Lee, to shed his light on this issue, though. I would say that as we go, we get to the point closer and closer and closer. Now, my last category of question could be in the area that to make our judgment about is it a good deal or a bad deal, why don't we assume what will happen, what will be happening if we did not negotiate a deal at all?
Well, if you didn't have this deal, what would continue would be the sanctions regime that would continue to cut off access for the Iranian government to weapons, arms, cash, and other supplies. That would force the Iranians to have to make a choice in terms of the types of terrorist activities and type of proxy wars they're supporting. I mean, the whole idea behind sanctions is to limit what the Iranians do. And sanctions are put in place not just because of the nuclear things that Iran has done, but they're in place because of the terrorist activities Iran has done. So, I'll give you an example. In the fine print and the appendixes of the agreement, which is only 159 pages long, is provisions, for example, that the head of Quds Force, which is the Iranian secret paramilitary unit that carries out terrorist operations. The head of that force had previously been restricted under UN agreement and US agreement that he couldn't travel outside of Iran. Well, as part of the deal, he gets to travel wherever he wants to go now. So it's little things like that enable the Iranians to go ahead and engage in the type of activities related to terrorism that they want to do. So that's why this deal isn't about nukes. It's about Iran expanding and getting involved in all the types of terrorist activities that it's historically done.
To get to the very point, though, what triggered the negotiation of the deal? Because is it because the Iranian is doing worse, or is it because there might be a chance they're doing better, there might be a chance going one step forward to make this deal? What is the...
What triggered it is that, the Iranians realized after the 2009 election that they were in big trouble. The world had really cracked down. The 2010 sanctions got put in place, cutting them off of the international banking system, and they were in a really bad way. And so what they figured out is that Obama really wanted to have a win. He wanted to be able to say, I fixed things with Iran.
In other words...
So they gave him a president, Hassan Rouhani, who spoke English, was a nice guy, and also had his own Twitter feed. So, the idea was that here was a guy who could talk to President Obama, be a like-minded person, and project an image of moderation, and then give President Obama the excuse he needed to try to close the deal. That's the only thing that changed. Nothing else changed from what Iran did.
In other words, the foundation, the timing of this whole deal is that Iranian was working better towards better because the sanctions are working.
Yeah, they were in
the blood being the money is drying out.
They were in real trouble.
They were in real trouble. If the sanctions keeps on going, things will get better, even better than with this deal. Am I right?
Yeah, if the sanctions had gone in place, understand the other thing that people don't realize is that under the interim agreement back in April, actually before that in November the year before in 2014, one of the provisions was that Iran was going to get access to a limited amount of funds. Okay, how much money did they get? They got $60 billion.
All right,
Okay.
that's a lot.
Yeah, they got $60 billion in $17 billion payments. Now, the entire country of Iran, its entire foreign currency reserve is only $25 billion. So we effectively doubled the amount of money that they got. Now, at the time that happened, what was happening in world oil prices? World oil prices went from $105 a barrel to $45 a barrel.
45,
so Iran literally lost 2/3 of its economy overnight. And what did we do? We gave them $60 billion in bailout money. Okay. Not only did we fund Iran better than we funded our own banks during
In
the
other words,
mortgage
we
meltdown.
bailed them out with the $60 billion.
Exactly.
I see. All right. Okay. Now we, for the whole show, been talking about Obama administration, about its foreign policies or diplomatic approaches, however. Speaking of that, we have one issue to mention. We can't afford not to mention. It's about the U.S.-Cuban relations, right? I heard that flags were first flew.
Yeah.
I mean, I saw yesterday, right?
Yeah.
So what's your comment on the Cuban-U.S. relationship called normalization, please?
Well, I think that a lot of people recognize that Cuba was a much different situation because of two things. One, Cuba's economy was completely in tatters because Cuba's primary sponsor was Russia. And Russia was starting to cut Cuba off from economic aid and economic support, especially as global oil prices fell, because that's Russia's main form of income. So Cuba was really isolated. It had nowhere to go, and it was running out of money. So a normalization with Cuba is more likely to result in a more stabilized situation because Cuba doesn't have the size in terms of a military, doesn't have the resources in terms of its economy, it doesn't have the mass in just in terms of population that Iran, for example, does. So, and Cuba is an island. It's an isolated country. It has no borders.
In other words, you're in support of the Cuban normalization?
I think it's less objectionable for a lot of people. I think the only people that really objected to the Cuban normalization were obviously Cuban expatriates who wanted to see a change in the political structure in Cuba. Because remember, Cuba is still a communist country. It still does not allow, a free press. It still does not allow, free communications and free travel. I'll give you an example. During the CONCACAF Gold Cup, the soccer matches that are going on that are held in the United States, the Cuban team came to the U.S. to play. By the time they landed, 4 of their players defected. So if things are so great in Cuba and we're going to normalize it, why are they still defecting? And I think that in Cuba's case, and it's a very good analogy to Iran, in Cuba's case, we had all the cards to force Cuba to change its behavior and become a free and open democracy. And yet, when we had all those cards, we folded.
In other words, Obama at least sees some opportunity to have done something in this area to normalize the relationship between U.S. and Cuba.
Yeah,
right?
and in Cuba's case, the effort would have been very minimal. You could have made certain demands that Cuba releases political prisoners, that Cuba opens up its news media, that Cuba allows open, free travel. Those 3 things, for example, might have been enough to go ahead and spark democracy and democratic change in Cuba and reinforce, opening up, normalized relationships. But we didn't even do that much in Cuba's case.
And also, you mentioned about the next presidency will probably stop the Iranian deal or so on and so forth. And then with this Cuban normalization, though, do you think the next presidency will start something else?
I think there are a lot of people, speaking for my party, for example, Republicans, I think there's a sentiment that, if we are going to go ahead and not roll back on Cuba, we can let the open American free market take a stab at democratizing Cuba. In a lot of ways, you can see in Cuba what could potentially happen there, what happened in China. China, for example, is still a communist country, but it recognized the benefits of a free market and switched its economy. And under that, you had a flourishing of democratic sensibilities because there was larger access to media, larger access to international travel, larger access to international companies and marketing and ideas and film and so forth. That type of influence might take root in Cuba because you would have the normalization of relations. So I think there's some similarities in terms of the model, and there's some similarities in terms of what you could be doing. But the common element is that when you talk about communism, you talk about a form of government. When you talk about Iran, the form of government is a belief in God. That's a big difference.
All right. So, all right, we start to see the big difference between Cuba and the Iran. So these two deals we're talking about, at least one is good so far. And now, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for watching the show. And to my good friend, Mr. James Lee, thank you for coming. Thank you for sharing.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Good job.